and you should get a notification here. Okay.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Becky Mace, and I'm a librarian for Spokane Public Library. And it has been a while since I've done some virtual programming, so I was excited to host this program. Patricia Meredith was a local author here in Spokane, and she did move, but she's continuing to write books that still follow our local history. And so she was able to join us via Zoom today. And this is also being live streamed to YouTube. So if anyone has any questions during the presentation, you can use the chat box if you're in Zoom. You can also write a comment on YouTube. I can make sure it gets answered. If nothing comes up, at the end of the presentation, we will end the live stream so that people in the Zoom call here can ask questions and not be recorded. So if it cuts off abruptly, I'm just letting you know on the live stream. All right, I'm going to read a quick land acknowledgement and we'll get going. I'm on the traditional homelands of the 4 bands of the Spokane Tribe of Indians: Upper Band, Middle Band, Lower Band, Chewelah Band. Since time immemorial, the Spokane Tribe of Indians has lived and cared for these grounds, identifying themselves as flesh of the earth. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We show gratitude to the land, river, and peoples who have been fishing, hunting, harvesting, and gathering here for generations. May we learn from one another's stories so that we may nurture the relationship of the people of the Spokane tribe and to all those who share this land. And to just take a look at our website to see a lot of really awesome in-person programming that we will be doing in the very near future. All right, introducing Patricia Meredith.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. Like Becky was saying, I unfortunately no longer live in Spokane, but I am very excited to be joining you guys today from Colorado Springs. My story of who Anna Katharine Green is and how she came to be a part of my life goes back to 2019. So 4 years ago, pre-COVID, before life changed completely. I was invited to be a guest speaker at the Kettle Falls Public Library Friends of the Library event. So I went out and I got to have tea with a bunch of wonderful people and give a presentation alongside 2 other fellow local authors. And the presentation that they asked me to give was about Anna Katharine Green. It was not about my upcoming book, Butcher Baker Candlestick Taker, which is the first in the Spokane Clock Tower mysteries, which I can talk a little bit more about later. But at that time, I had sent, a list of here are some topics I can give. And she saw Forgotten Mother of American Detective Fiction and thought, oh, that sounds like a great talking point. And so invited me to come out and speak about her. And at the end of the presentation, it went really well. And at the end, one of the other authors who was there with me came up to me and said, I'm so sorry I missed the beginning of your presentation. I had to leave for a second. So I missed, is your book that you just wrote about Anna Katharine Green? And I said, no, it's actually about Spokane in 1901 and the building of the clock tower and all of that. She said, oh, that sounds great. But I really think that your next book needs to be about Anna Katharine Green. And so now here I am 4 years later, having done a ton more research on who this woman was. One of the first things that I looked up was, has anybody already done that? Has somebody already written a historical fiction or historical mystery about Anna Katharine Green? I thought surely someone has, because she's incredibly influential on the mystery genre. She was an Agatha Christie of her time. And you know what? Nobody has. And still 4 years later, nobody has. The only book ever published about Anna Katharine Green is a biography, Patricia Maida's The Mother of Detective Fiction. And it's a biography that she wrote, I think, like for her dissertation. It was published in '89, I believe. So it's been years since that was published. That's the only thing that I could find. Other than that, there's forewords in certain publications of like the Leavenworth case, which is her first book. So like my copy has a wonderful foreword from Michael Sims, which explains who Anna Katharine Green was and how she was influential. And then you'll find magazines articles in magazines all over the place that talk about the history of the mystery genre. And they'll always mention Anna Katharine Green as the mother of detective fiction. But other than that, no one's ever written a historical fiction about her. So here I am. So this year, on May 30th this month. So I'm only, less than, I'm like 2 weeks away. And my book, A Deed of Dreadful Note, is finally coming out. It is the first book in the Anna Katharine Green mysteries, and it'll be an ebook, print, and audiobook. And it is now available for pre-order in some of those. You'll have to go searching for it. But if you go look for it, and then definitely ask for it through the library, because they do have my other books. So I hope that they'll be getting A Deed of Dreadful Note as well. I've been getting some great reviews up front. It's a wonderful story. It's really fun. It really focuses and uncovers a lot more about who she was as she writes her first debut novel, because the Leavenworth case came out, well, she started writing it 15 years before Sherlock Holmes. And yet, I promise, when you pick it up, the first thing you're going to think when you read the Leavenworth case is, wow, she must have been copying Sherlock. Or wow, she must have read Poirot. No, nobody was before her other than really there was the Moonstone and Dupont with Poe and things like that. But really, she is the start of a lot of the things that we now recognize in mystery fiction. And so that's what I uncover in my historical fiction book. So here is a little bit more about who this woman is, so that when you go and pick up my book, you will know what you're getting yourself into, because she's amazing. So, all right. But this is her, Anna Katharine Green. So I guess some starting questions are, have you enjoyed Sherlock Holmes and his deductive reasoning, or his friendship with Dr. Watson, or wondering how Sherlock accomplishes so much when he's afflicted with rheumatism later in his stories? Or perhaps Agatha Christie. Do you love the very first book that she wrote, Mysterious Affair at Styles, and loving the moment when Hercule Poirot realizes the importance of straightening the bits on the mantelpiece? He has to straighten the mantelpiece for a second time. Have you read Dorothy L. Sayers, her Lord Peter Wimsey novel, and you love how she'll often open with an inquest or a trial, and really bring forward all of the questions and talking to the possible murder suspects from the very beginning? Have you flipped to a crime scene map? Have you read a locked room mystery, a manor house mystery, a mystery set in New York City, a detective series following the escapades of an American detective, a mystery entwined with a romance that seems doomed from the beginning? All of this and so much more began with, in 1878, the publication of The Leavenworth Case by Anna Katharine Green. It was proclaimed as one of the best detective stories ever written, and she would go on to sell over 1 million copies of just this first book, not to mention publish 36 other books that later caused the papers to declare she had changed mystery fiction. Like I said, Edgar Allan Poe is often called the father of American detective fiction, because he was the first to introduce the world to detective fiction as a genre with the Murders on the Rue Morgue, and that was in 1841. But then who was the mother of detective fiction? And that is Anna Katharine Green, many years later. So one of the things that you'll see as I'm talking is I basically went through and I took the highlights from a timeline that I made that I actually just posted today on my blog at patricia-meredith.com. So after my presentation, if you want to know more, I highly recommend you go check out that blog, because not only is it a timeline of her life, but I went ahead and included the history of mystery basically throughout her lifetime. So you could see what came before her, what came during her, and what came after her, right? So what did she inspire, and also what inspired her, because she didn't come up with everything. No, we always take ideas from other people and we put them all together, but she's credited as really being the one who took a lot of those great ideas and put them all together and made the mystery genre what it is today and what we know today. So it's a really interesting timeline to flip through. So we start with, she was born November 11th, 1846 in Brooklyn, New York, and her family moved a lot as a child. She mostly moved between Manhattan and Buffalo, but all over New York State and the surrounding states there. She was the youngest of 4. She had one oldest sister and then 2 brothers and then her. And then her mother passed away when she was only 3, as well as a younger brother. They got sick. I forget exactly what it was. I think it was smallpox. It'll be in that timeline. Her father eventually remarried to Grace Hollister, who was a woman who would have an incredible impact on her life. And we'll get to that in a minute. She was also college educated. Anna Katharine Green went to Ripley College in Vermont, which was very rare for women at that time. and it was a female college. Now, while she was there, she really focused on her poetry. She really wanted to be a poetess. And one of the people who happened along her path while she was there was none other than Ralph Waldo Emerson. So speaking of networking and getting great endorsements, she met Emerson. Now, at this point in time, a poetess could not publish herself. The only way to get published was to be sponsored by a male poet, because that was the late 1800s. So she wrote to Emerson and asked him to read some of her poetry. She sent several of her poems to him. And basically he wrote back and said, don't quit your day job. He was very complimentary. He said, it's really good. You have definitely, you have a flair for this, a talent for writing, but yeah, you might not want to just pursue this, maybe pursue some other avenues. So she was heartbroken, naturally. But that being said, I did want to share one of her poems because I really love her poetry, especially her shorter stuff. I think Emerson might have been right about some of her longer things, especially today when we think of poetry and we think short and sweet, and not the long epic poems. And so this is an example of one of her shorter ones that I love, and it's called Pearls. And it's the wave that floods the trembling shore and desolates the strand, and ebbing leaves mid froth and wreck a shell upon the sand. So troubles oft o'erwhelm the soul and shake the constant mind, that in retreating leave a pearl of memory behind. And I just love that. And it gives you an idea of some of the poetic nature of her writing. And what you're going to see later in her fiction is that definitely comes through. So eventually she would go on to get married, and she has 3 kids, but that wasn't until after she'd become the Agatha Christie of her day. She publishes 3 or 4 books, including her poetry, before she gets married. But one of the videos that'll be going up on my YouTube channel on this Saturday is a video about how Anna Katharine Green and I are very, very similar. I love finding all the connections between us. And one of them is that she was a mother. So she was raising kids in a time when women weren't supposed to have jobs and just be there raising their kids. And yet she was a very famous published author. In fact, her husband was often overshadowed by her, but he didn't care because he fully supported her writing. And in fact, they collaborated on several endeavors later in their marriage. So I just love seeing that. Something else that she continued to do was she always used her maiden name. She was always published as Anna Katharine Green. Later publications, sometimes in parentheses, will include her married name, but she published under her own name, which makes her the first female author of detective fiction to do that, to write under her own name, to not use a pseudonym. Many people credited Anna Katharine Green as the very first to author American detective fiction, but she's actually not. There was a woman, or the very first woman to do so. There actually was a woman who did so, but she wrote under the name Seeley Register, and it wasn't until later, and she wrote dime novels. So a little bit shorter fiction. The Leavenworth Case and all of Anna Katharine Green's novels you'll see are much longer books. So Anna Katharine Green is the first in that way, but we definitely have to give credit where credit is due to the women who came before her, including Alcott, the author of The Mysterious Key and What It Opened, but you might know her better as the author of Little Women. She actually authored a short novella mystery before Anna Katharine Green, but definitely inspired her in her writing. So there's lots of influences. And again, you'll see all that in the timeline. It's very cool to see how it all works out. So back in 1872, it was her stepmother who encouraged her to try her hand at a novel. And that's why she was incredibly influential. She loved Anna's work, really encouraged her to pursue her own dreams, to not just be looking to get married, which is odd to hear at that point in time, but really encouraged her to, find your spot in history and make your mark. And that was Gryce Hollister, and she's an incredible character who you'll meet in my novel as well. So by that time, Anna Katharine Green would have been inspired by the likes of Wilkie Collin, Emile Gaboriau, and many more like that. But again, all men. She spent 6 years on the manuscript for The Leavenworth Case, her first novel, and then published it in 1878. And like I said, my book, A Deed of Dreadful Note, really focuses on that. So I'm going to kind of skip forward, because if you want to know more about that, you should read the book. But we're going to skip forward to the reviews after publication, beginning with none other than Wilkie Collins. Now, if you might recognize that name, but you're like, wait, who's Wilkie Collins? He authored The Moonstone and The Woman in White. Those are his two like big names that you would recognize him for. And they are fascinating mysteries, and they do include a detective. So he was one of the first to offer a review of the Leavenworth case. And it was, have I read the Leavenworth case? Yes, I read it through at one sitting. Her powers of invention are so remarkable. She has so much imagination and so much belief, a most important qualification for our art. Excuse me, in what she writes, that I have nothing to report of myself so far, but most sincere admiration. Dozens of times in reading the story, I have stopped to admire the fertility of invention, the delicate treatment of incidents, and the fine perception of the influence of events on the personages of the story. So, glowing reviews. But not all reviews were positive. In fact, reviewers insisted that Anna Katharine Green must be a pseudonym for some man. I don't know why a man would write under a woman's name, but nevertheless, people actually thought that, because they said the story was manifestly beyond a woman's powers. In fact, there was a whole argument where was it? It's a whole story where there's a bunch of men arguing over who wrote it. And a lawyer steps up and says, no, I've met Anna Katharine Green. She really did write this. And they're like, no, it's not possible. And it's a great story. Mostly this is due to her descriptions. They are extremely detailed for a woman writing at that time. And the reason she knows all these things is because her father was a lawyer. And so she sat in on his cases and she helped him prepare for his cases. And so the first thing you notice about the Leavenworth case is that the subtitle is A Lawyer's Story. And at that time, most mystery novels, like Seeley Register's The Dead Letter, so the very first American detective novel, the dime novel, is an American romance, semicolon, an American romance. Because at that time, detective stories were often called criminal romances. In fact, Anna Katharine Green refers to them that way. But yet her book is about a lawyer, and it definitely has romance, don't get me wrong. But it also has extremely detailed reports, like from the surgeon. He talks about where the bullet entered and the cause of death for Mr. Leavenworth. And it's rather graphic and kind of medical, even by today's standards when you pick it up. So it's really interesting. So her father was a criminal attorney, and she clearly learned a lot at his side. So the book opens with an inquest, and it just dives right in. And it's very clear that she knows exactly what she's talking about. The entire book deals with the question of circumstantial evidence, which is a huge word for evidence that could go either way. It could either support one person or not support one person. And so it's evidence that you're like, well, it's circumstantial, right? It depends on the circumstance. So the Leavenworth case was so well written and so good about showing the faux pas and the perils of circumstantial evidence that it was used by Yale University in law classes to teach about it. So this is a fiction book written by a woman, and it's being taught in Yale University law classes. It's incredible. It's mind-blowing. That's what she was able to achieve with her first novel. So later, you might recognize Agatha Christie talking about the Leavenworth case. Hercule Poirot actually mentions it in The Clocks, which was published in 1963. He's going through a description of several major mysteries written at that time. And one of the things that Agatha Christie does is she'll mention different mysteries and different detectives in some of her books. And this is one of those episodes where Poirot says, the Leavenworth case is admirable. One savored its atmosphere, its studied and deliberate melodrama. Those rich and lavish descriptions of the golden beauty of Eleanor, the moonlight beauty of Mary. And there is the maidservant, Hannah, so true to type, and the murderer, an excellent psychological study. So even Agatha Christie mentions the Leavenworth case in her autobiography as one of the inspirational books that got her going where she went on to be. So it's really interesting to see how much how much Anna Katharine Green inspired future detectives and future authors that we know today. So we open with Mr. Leavenworth is dead, murdered, shot through the head by some unknown person while sitting at his library table. And then the whole story is told from the first person point of view of a young lawyer. So just like her father. His name is Everett Raymond, and he had worked with Leavenworth, and then he's called to the house to once they discover the body. And there he meets Eleanor Leavenworth, who immediately falls in love with, because it is a Victorian novel at the heart. But like I said, that is not the focus. It's all of her details that just, it expounds upon so much. So should you pick up the Leavenworth case, you'll notice very quickly that although it has its Victorian romantic tropes, the amount of detail dedicated to the detective side is admirable for a novel of its time period. A mystery with a love story at its center, as well as many other devices she uses, make the book feel quite full of tropes. So like I said, you'll pick it up, you'll go to read it, and you'll be like, oh, this is just like everything else that I've ever read, right? Well, but you have to remember that it's tropey because everyone copied her. It all started with her. And so when you start thinking about that, you start noticing all of the things. You're like, oh my gosh, that's in every novel that I read now, right? That every mystery, cozy mystery, right? Follows the same formula, uses the same things. So things like as simple as cliffhanger chapter endings. She's very good at those. The locked room mystery, a plot carried forward mostly by dialogue rather than description. The importance of the ballistics, the inquest, the surgeon's report, a crime scene map, a secret marriage, a missing key, a vanished servant, a forged confession, ciphered messages, overheard arguments, a changed will, a second murder, and a memorable denouement. In fact, Detective Gryce even sets up a classic trap at the end into which the killer falls. And all of that is just in her first novel. So I have a couple quotes that share exactly what I think. Patricia Maida, so in her biography about Anna Katharine Green, she says that she was recognized as the female stylist who helped shape detective fiction into the classic form we see today. The female stylist. I love that because I think that's exactly what she did. Is she brought everything together and made it what we recognize today. Howard Haycroft wrote, Anna Katharine Green's plots are models of careful construction that can still hold their own against today's competition. For this quality, and by virtue of precedence and sustained popularity, she occupies an undisputed and honorable place in the development of the American detective story. And yet, most people have never heard of her today. In Anna Katharine Green's work, we can discern for the first time in its entirety the pattern that became characteristic of most English detective novels written during the following 50 years. And that was from Alma Murch. So again, one of the things that you'll find is you'll pick up her books and you're like, wait, this feels very familiar. Well, yeah, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle went on to write books that were following the same format. And Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and G.K. Chesterton and all of these authors that came after her, they were greatly inspired by Anna Katharine Green. So she definitely left her fingerprint on the mystery genre. So really getting into her detective. She excels at procedural detection, the gradual unfolding of the mystery through successful unearthing of clue after clue. She makes very clear distinctions between her professional sleuths and her amateurs, and she shows the strengths and weaknesses of both. So even in the Leavenworth case, you end up with an amateur detective in Everett Raymond, and then your professional, which is Detective Ebenezer Gryce. And we're going to introduce him here in a minute. He is the first recurring American detective in a series of novels. Poe's Detective Dupin was only in 3 short stories, and he was French. Émile Gaboriau's stories features a French detective. In fact, most detectives were French at that time because they were the first ones to set up that system within the police force. So Gryce is the first reoccurring American detective seen in fiction. He's also the first flawed detective, meaning he has his faults and he's not always perfect, right? Dupin, Gaboriau's Lecoq, and then even arguably Sherlock, right? They all are perfect. The only flaw is in their brilliance. Sherlock will later have problems that are added by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He adds in some addictions and some medical problems. But other than that, right, he's still perfection, brilliance, brilliant. So Detective Gryce, this is why I fell in love with him, was because of this opening description of him. This is from the Leavenworth case. Mr. Gryce smiled darkly at the doorknob. It has a dreadful look, I exclaimed. Mr. Gryce immediately frowned at the doorknob. And here let me say that Mr. Gryce, the detective, was not the thin, wiry individual with the piercing eye you are doubtless expecting to see. On the contrary, Mr. Gryce was a portly, comfortable personage with an eye that never pierced, that did not even rest on you. If it rested anywhere, it was always on some insignificant object in the vicinity, some vase, inkstand, book, or button. These things he would seem to take into his confidence, make the repositories of his conclusions. But as for you, you might as well be the steeple on Trinity Church for all connection you ever appeared to have with him or his thoughts. At present, then, Mr. Gryce was, as I have already suggested, on intimate terms with the doorknob. And the rest of her descriptions of him go along that line. So needless to say, Detective Gryce suffers from a tendency to avoid eye contact, which makes the way that she describes him constantly endearing. Because he's never looking at a person. And yet, like Columbo, right, another future detective who is always solving mysteries by being bumbling, oh, by the way, one more question, right? That's Columbo's thing, is they underestimate Columbo. They think, oh, he can't possibly solve this because he's not really paying attention. And the same thing goes for Mr. Gryce. They always underestimate his potential. And yet he finds things, he sees into the heart of a person very easily, or he sees the reflection of the person in something else, but he definitely sees the truth in them, and he gets right to the heart of the matter. So in addition to that, he suffers from rheumatism and gout. So when the lawyer sees him later in the book, he is lying on the couch with bandages around his hands and feet. And because of his health, he's often laid up and he needs help. So this reminds you of somebody or some buddies in like Sherlock's novels. He has the Sherlock, the Baker Street irregulars, right? He has a group of street urchins who gather information for him when he's laid up. Well, so does Gryce, or I should say Gryce did it first. He has his group of investigators. One of them in the Leavenworth case is called Q, like Bond's inventor Q, because he's a query. And he's very good at questioning people. And then another one is Fob, because he's very good at watching people, like a fob watch, but I'm ching. So she's very good at creating wonderful characters that assist and play around with her main characters in each of her books. So this also makes Gryce the first time we see the armchair detective. So that's a detective who solves the mystery without collecting clues himself and only by using his extensive knowledge of human nature and his deductive powers, or his little gray cells, like Poirot will go on to call them. And that all begins with Gryce. He says things that might call to mind other detectives who've come after him. For example, when Detective Gryce answers the question whom he suspects of the murder, he says everyone and nobody. And then another thing he says is, it is not enough to look for evidence where you expect it, where you expect to find it. You must sometimes search for it where you don't. That sounds very familiar, and especially this one. Now it is a principle which every detective recognizes that if of 100 leading circumstances connected with a crime, 99 of these are acts pointing to the suspected party with unerring certainty. But the 100th, equally important act is one which that person could not have performed. The whole fabric of suspicion is destroyed. And again, there's a lot of quotes. As you're reading through it, you're like, that sounds like something Sherlock or Poirot or somebody will say further down the line. There's nothing new under the sun. So it's all very influential, but it's so much fun to find it coming out of Gryce from the very beginning. So, in fact, Gryce himself once wrote a letter to Sherlock. So, two fictional characters writing to each other, published in the newspaper. So in 1917, he wrote to Sherlock saying how he had heard that he was now afflicted with rheumatism, that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had given Sherlock Holmes rheumatism and encouraged him to, try to induce Conan Doyle to give you some clever fellow as an assistant. For now that we have a bond of sympathy, let us proceed to end our days in the harness and help our friends, Doyle and Green, out of their various difficulties as occasion may demand. So it's a wonderful little letter. It's a very good marketing ploy because in it, Anna Katharine Green is pitching the fact that, I have a new book coming out called The Last Bow, I think is the one that she's talking about in there. Which is another one that, the title might sound familiar. But then he mentions That Affair Next Door, which is Miss Butterworth's first mystery. And you'll just see there's a whole bunch of references throughout the whole letter. So, and again, you can find that on my website, or I did a whole video about how Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was inspired by Anna Katharine Green. In fact, Arthur Conan Doyle himself visited Green when he came to America. So one of the people he wanted to meet was Anna Katharine Green because she had inspired him so much. And that was in 1894. So very influential. So right there, we mentioned That Affair Next Door, Miss Butterworth. So who is Miss Butterworth? Oh, she's one of my favorite characters. She's probably my favorite amateur detective of Anna Katharine Green's, Miss Amelia Butterworth. So she is the first introduction of a spinster amateur detective. Again, might sound familiar, might sound a little bit like Miss Marple from Agatha Christie. Well, she's greatly inspired by this character. So Miss Amelia Butterworth is introduced in this way. I am not an inquisitive woman, but when, in the middle of a certain warm night in September, I heard a carriage draw up at the adjoining house and stop, I could not resist the temptation of leaving my bed and taking a peep through the curtains of my window. So she can't help herself. She's just a little busybody like Miss Marple, and she's so much fun. So she sees a whole mystery play out. I won't go into too much detail because it's probably the novel I would recommend you start with, actually. If you're not going to start with the Leavenworth case, the other one that I would recommend you start with is That Affair Next Door, because it is all told from Miss Butterworth's point of view, and she is hilarious. She's wonderful. She is an older, unmarried woman of inborn principle and strict Presbyterian training. She lives in Gramercy Park in a brownstone. And upon seeing the body, for example, she says, at a sight so dreadful and in spite of all my apprehensions, so unexpected, I felt a sensation of sickness, which in another moment might have ended in my fainting also, if I had not realized that it would never do for me to lose my wits in the presence of a man who had none too many of his own. So I shook off my momentary weakness. Something else, so the whole mystery is the only reason she gets involved is because she makes it her point to prove to Gryce that she is worthy of being his assistant, and not just his assistant, but better than, not he calls her a meddlesome old maid. So, like Miss Marple, but he definitely enjoys pushing her buttons just to see what she might accomplish. So in the end, you definitely see Gryce coming along behind her and giving her that extra push to get her to where she needs to be. She describes Gryce at the first as of portly build and benevolent aspect, a fatherly looking man, and not at all the person one would be likely to associate with the police. Yet he could take the lead very naturally, and when he spoke, I felt bound to answer him. But then, because it's the first person account, like I said, she's very funny from her perspective, we get to hear what she really thinks of Detective Gryce, which is often quite funny or snarky. For example, she says, abiding by my invariable rule of never arguing with a man, unless I see some way of getting the better of him, I did what he bade me. So only when she can get the better of a man will she argue, which is awesome. She says, I must have shown what was passing in my mind, and he must have seen it reflected on the polished surface of the porcelain he was contemplating, for his lips showed the shadow of a smile sufficiently sarcastic for me to see that he was far from being as easy-natured as his countenance indicated. Or later she says, if the image he had under his eye had not been made of bronze, I am sure it would have become petrified by the look he now gave it. What to me seemed but the natural proposition of an energetic woman with a special genius for his particular calling evidently struck him as audacity of the grossest kind. In the end, her knowledge for clothing and being a woman and the details that go with that at that time of clothing and the social and cultural and psychological implications of what a woman wore at that time, that's what she brings to the murder. And it's her most valuable asset. It's absolutely fascinating how it gets interwoven into each of the mysteries where she takes the lead. Just very like the societal implications. And it just gives her great insight into a person. For example, like at one point, they're looking at the body and she knows exactly that it's made of blue serge. That's store made, very good, must have come from Altman's or Stearns. And so she knows which store it was. So then they can go to the store and they can ask questions about the dead woman, things like that. It all comes down to the matter of a hat pin. So it's, where is the hat pin and where would it have been kept and how could it have been used and things like that. And it's all details that only a woman would know. And so that's why she's very influential. So again, powerful. Later, she says one of my favorite quotes. I can put it in here. Yep. I think she is younger than either you or myself, I deigned to reply. Her narrow pointed shoes show she has not yet reached the years of discretion. So I just love the way she uses her knowledge to impact what she's saying, the dialogue she's saying, the way that Anna Katharine Green uses that, right? She's not written the same as Gryce, and it shows through. So she definitely has variety to her. Like I said, she's very, very similar to Christie's Miss Marple, older, single woman. She's often overlooked, taken to be a simple busybody, a gossip, and pushed to the side, but she's really incredibly intelligent and stubborn and determined to prove that her disadvantages are an advantage. In the end, she is also fallible. She's not always right, but so is Gryce. And that's something that Anna Katharine Green definitely brings to the table every single time in her mysteries, is her point that the detective does not always get it exactly correctly at the end. And I really appreciate that. There's always some tidbit that is the final twist, and it's because the detective doesn't always know from the very beginning. Same with Miss Amelia Butterworth. So after her, the spinster detective, Green introduced her girl detective, who is going to sound very familiar again, a lot like, and the inspiration for Nancy Drew. So in The Golden Slipper and Other Problems for Violet Strange, which was published in 1915, we have a collection of 9 short stories. And in the very first, we are introduced to Miss Strange, and it's a wonderful description. So I'm just going to read it for you. You want a mystery solved? It is not a matter for the police, that is, as yet. And so you come to me, and when I ask for the facts, I find that women, and only women, are involved, and that these women are not only young, but one and all of the highest society. Happily, I know such a person, a girl of gifts and extraordinarily well placed for the purpose. Why she uses her talents in this direction, why, with means enough to play the part natural to her as a successful debutante, she consents to occupy herself with social and other mysteries, you must ask her, not me. Enough that I promise you her aid if you want it. That is, if you can interest her. One of her idiosyncrasies is a theoretical dislike of her work, but once she gets interested, nothing will hold her back. So like Butterworth in the social class and ethical values, but unlike Miss Butterworth, she is liberated in the debutante manner. She is young and works for detection for pay, and you find out why she has to work for money later. At the time of the writing of this collection, it's important to note that Anna was 60. So her daughter Rosamond would be Violet's age. So basically she wrote an entire series of short stories with her daughter as the central detective, which I think is just wonderful. She's described as having chestnut-colored hair and a small mobile face. Violet is like the flower. She is known as the little detective. She's the daughter of a business tycoon. She lives a privileged life. She lives in the family home on Fifth Avenue, which is luxurious. She's driven about the city in a chauffeured limousine, and she wears expensive clothes and is invited to select social events. So she is the person to know. Because of that, again, she's often disregarded and overlooked because of her gender and her youth. But as her employer says, sometimes that's the only person who can get to the root of things, right? She's the only one who can get in there and really talk to people. Like Nancy Drew, you find a wide range of issues in these short stories, from ghosts to missing persons to even a couple murders. So it's definitely, I sometimes wonder how much it inspired the future of, young adult novels, young books written for younger people, because it definitely has all of the elements that you see later in fiction. So Violet is quite intelligent. She's intuitive. She's capable of quick deductions. She's like a young Sherlock Holmes and a debutante from high society, which gets her in sometimes to places where others could not, with people who trust her as one of their own. She is a practical truth seeker. She uses induction and deduction. There's nothing feminine about her thinking process. She approaches each situation as a mathematical problem. And I love that that is how she is described, because in Victorian novels, you don't see women described that way. They are never described by their brain. They are always described by their looks. And so it is wonderful to see a main character who is described as mathematical, as having a STEM mind is what we would be thinking of it today. So Violet demonstrates that a woman, even a young and privileged one, is capable of heady and gutsy work. Her detective method indicates a talent for logic and mathematical puzzles, disproving the ongoing notion that females are all heart. And that's actually a quote from Patricia Maida in her book, her biography. So Violet often makes comments that we hear Sherlock remark on. Again, quotes that you're like, wow, that sounds like something Sherlock is going to say. For example, she says, "It will be a useless concession on my part. A place that has been gone over by a dozen detectives is apt to be brushed clean of its cobwebs, even if such ever existed." So she's always complaining that the police are getting in front of her and ruining all of her, all the clues that are left behind. It is also through the mouth of Violet Strange that Green reveals her fascination with the colonial 1700s. So she has a whole quote where she's talking about the house and real colonial, isn't it? I wish I could see the rooms inside before it is disturbed. Such doors and such dear old-fashioned mantelpieces as it must have. I just dote on the colonial. It brings up such pictures of the old days, weddings, and parties, all so different from ours and so much more interesting. I love that because it just shows there's nothing new under the sun. A woman writing in 1915 is fascinated by the 1700s. Oh, they lived so much better lives back then in the 1700s. And so often we think today, oh, they lived so much better lives in 1915. Well, maybe not 1915 exactly, because that's during the war, but in between, and so it's still, we're always fascinated by the history, the beauty of history. So that leads us into The Forsaken Inn. I forgot that cover. So there you go, Violet Strange. The Forsaken Inn, which is often credited as the first historical mystery ever written. So historical mystery means that it takes place not in the author's modern day, right? So what I write is historical mystery because all of my mysteries take place not in 2023 or even 2020 or even 2000. My books all take place in 1901 is the Spokane Clock Tower Mysteries, and then Anna Katharine Green takes place in the 1870s. And so her book, The Forsaken Inn, was published in 1890, but it takes place in the colonial 1700s. In fact, it all has to do with 1775 and the Revolutionary War era, and then it takes place 16 years later. So it starts in 1775, and then something happens, and then 16 years later, we come back to that same spot, and there's a whole mystery there. It is wonderful. It is really evocative. It's a very different format and voice from her other books. It's much more moody and brooding and gothic compared to her other detective novels, which makes it a lot more similar. And you can really see the impact of Wilkie Collins, again, of The Moonstone and Woman in White. You can see his influence on her writing, or perhaps even Northanger Abbey and those kinds of books. Awesome. So The Forsaken Inn is a locked room mystery, which deals with a mystery that happens 1775, and then you jump forward. I think it's about 16 years later. And it's one of those, when you read it, the opening, she kind of gives everything away. It's not exactly what I would call a whodunit, or maybe a whatdunit. Like, exactly kind of what happened. It's more of a why done it. Why would this person do this thing? And it's more of just it's very historical. It's very interesting to see her perception in 1890 of the Revolutionary War era, right? What did people think of the 1700s at that time? Because is it the same or is it different than how we perceive it today? It's not all Hamilton, but it's very interesting. So in the end, when Anna Katharine Green died, the New York Times had this to say: April 12th, 1935. Noted author, 88. The Leavenworth Case in 78, followed by 36 other books. Wanted to write poetry, wrote detective stories to draw attention to her verse, changed mystery fiction. So again, Anna Katharine Green can be thanked for so many of the devices and things that we recognize in fiction today. The flawed professional detective in Ebenezer Gryce, the spinster amateur detective in Miss Amelia Butterworth, the young girl detective in Violet Strange, and the historical mystery in The Forsaken Inn, not to mention all the other things that I listed, right? She is absolutely the mother of American detective fiction. So don't let her be forgotten. And that's my goal with my books. So you can find all of Anna Katharine Green's books in the public domain, obviously. They are all in print, ebook, audiobook formats, through the library, through our library, the Spokane Public Library. I know they have a ton of them available. You can get them through Hoopla. You can get them online for free through different e-readers. I, again, recommend starting with the Leavenworth case because it's her debut novel. But I also really love each of these other three. So depending on which one really called out to you, go ahead and start there, right? If you really love the spinster detective, then I would go with That Affair Next Door. If you want to see the influence of Nancy Drew, or the influence upon Nancy Drew, The Golden Slipper is excellent. It's just a series of short stories, so it's a very quick read. I would say it's one of her quicker reads because the others are definitely longer novels. And then, or The Forsaken Inn, if you want to read a historical mystery. So you also coming soon. Yes, almost forgot that. We are actually releasing, my husband and I are releasing editions of the Leavenworth case. Because it is in the public domain, we're making a very special edition that will include an introduction by myself, including a lot of the information that I have gathered on Anna Katharine Green, just a little bit more about her, and tying it all into my book, A Deed of Dreadful Note. And so if you want to listen to the Leavenworth case read by my husband and his dulcet tones, that will be coming out very soon. We're putting the finishing touches on that. We had to get my book done first. And then this will be coming out. So if you want to know more, definitely follow me, and then that'll be available soon. And then this is my book. So I thought, given who has arrived tonight, I thought I would offer you guys, if you would like to get an advance review copy of my book, I do have ebook and audiobook links available that I can send you. All I ask is that you leave me a review when you are finished reading it. So this is an advance review copy, meaning it is not the final version, but it would be yours to own. So if you're interested, definitely email me and just say, hey, I was at your presentation. I would love a copy of either the ebook or the audiobook. The ebook is readable on all devices, Kindle, everything. And then the audiobook will come to you as a Spotify link. So it'll download on Spotify, and then you can listen at your leisure. And that one is read by me. So, but otherwise, definitely when the library gets the book in, then you can put it on hold and, start a big reading list there. So, and then real quick, this is my other series, which is also already available through the library. So if you're interested in reading more of my books and learning more about Spokane history, because they're all based in Spokane in 1901, this is the Spokane Clock Tower Mysteries. And this is just the first 3 in the series. I am currently working on the next 3. I'm trying to do them in bouts of 3 in trilogies. So we have more story to tell, but in the meantime, these are really fun to dive into. And it's a lot of locations that you'll recognize and local history from Spokane that you'll recognize. And they're just a lot of fun. So there's my last page. And I guess now we do questions.
We will take it